Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm sharing the third card in my Compartmental Christmas card making series. When I first saw the World and Santa and Sleigh dies, I knew I wanted to combine them somehow to create a Christmas card. In this video, along with sharing how to create this card, I'm sharing a fun little discovery about paper. And as in the other videos, I'm sharing some options on how you can create this card for mass production and compartmental making. If you're interested in any of the products I'm sharing in this video, you can find links to them in the description box below. When you shop through those links, you're supporting me at no extra cost to you, and I really appreciate that so very much. The supplies I'm going to be working with in this video include several dies and stamp sets by Tim Holtz. And first up, I'm going to be using the Bold Text Christmas die set. I'm going to specifically be using this one that says Peace on Earth. So any kind of die that says Peace on Earth would work if you're going to stick with the same design and theme I'm doing. But you could also switch out the die for anything or any of these other ones. I'm also going to be using the Vault Christmas Magic die set, and the die I'm going to be using from this is the Santa with the reindeer. There is also a Stamped Timber die set that had this same image in it, and they're really similar in size, so if you don't have this one and you have that one, you could switch those with each other. And then I'm also going to be using the Vault World Travel, and I'm going to be working with the globe die here. And there is an older globe die that would work as well if you have that or anything similar. And then the stamp sets I'm going to be using are the Music and Advert. I'm going to be using the Music Note set. You could use any kind of background type stamp for this. And the other one I'm going to be using is the Stripes and Holiday type, and I'm going to be using this text stamp here. Again, any of these could be switched out for other stamps and dies or something similar. The inks I'm going to be working with are Distress ink, and I'm going to be using Ground Espresso, Forest Moss, Gathered Twigs, Uncharted Mariner, and Pumice Stone. Again, feel free to switch out and use different colors. And if you want to use oxide inks instead of Distress inks, feel free to do that as well. Now for the paper, I have a little bit of something I wanted to share with you, but first up, I am going to be using some Kraft cardstock and some black Kraft stock. So the black Kraft stock is the Kraft core paper that has the black printed on it. You could just use regular black cardstock. However, I'm going to be doing some distressing to this. So having a paper that is not solid core, which means it's not this, like if the paper is this color all the way through, then you won't get the same effect. So if you happen to have some black cardstock that has a white core, you could get the same effect that I'm going to be doing. If you are a frequent follower here, you know that my go-to paper is Distress Watercolor cardstock. I use it almost exclusively, especially when I'm doing any kind of mixed media backgrounds. And you also know that I do tend to like to practice sometimes on less expensive paper just to not waste my good cardstock. And for this card, I did just that, and my husband happened to have this Staples brochure and flyer paper that he's been using for something, and it's a slightly thicker paper than regular printer paper would be. So I just grabbed a sheet of it to just use for practicing, and I was really pleasantly surprised how much it could tolerate when it came to the various mediums that I put onto it. I was able to do ink smooshing, stamping, distress spritz on it, and it tolerated all of it well. I actually also even used some texture paste on it, but it really struggled with that in the sense that the paper really wanted to warp, and it made it a little bit challenging to get it flattened back down while I was doing the rest of the steps to create the background. But I was pleasantly surprised for a much less expensive paper than, you know, Distress Watercolor cardstock. But so during the video here, I'm going to kind of do the background on both papers just to kind of show you how it looks very much the same. First off, I'm going to start off with just the base of the card. And for that, I'm going to be using the Kraft cardstock. And I'm going to be taking the holiday type stamp. And I'm going to create the pattern on the background here, very similar to the technique I used on the first card that I created in this series. And I'm just going to apply the ink to the stamp here. Give it a little spritz and then stamp it over onto my craft stock. The spritzing just gives it a little bit of a watercolor effect. And then just lift that up and give that a quick dry. And then just as in the first card that I made in this series, you can definitely skip this part of the process. If you want to save some time, you could just, work with the Kraft cardstock and skip the stamping part. And I'm just gonna line that back up as best I can. So that it looks like it's kind of a continuation of the stamping. And then just repeat that. Give that a little spritz. Get ink down a little lower. There we are. Yep, still a little bit short down there. Alrighty, and then give this a dry, and then that's pretty much finished. And then I'm not worried that this isn't perfect here because that's going to be covered up with the other layers that we're going to be creating here. So now I'm going to work on the background for the card, and I've got my two different cardstock. So I've got the Distress Watercolor cardstock and then that Staples laser jet inkjet paper. And I'm going to start off with doing some ink smishing. So I've got the Pumice Stone Distress ink, and if you wanted to work with the oxide inks, you certainly could. Just going to get some ink down here, smushed onto my craft mat, spritz that with a little water. I want to kind of get enough on there until the ink kind of starts beating up like this, and then I'm going to just smush the paper into the ink and kind of smear it around here. I'm not looking for any kind of dots or speckledy stuff as I normally like to do. I'm just kind of trying to get just like a nice wash of color across the background. So that's how it does with the Distress Watercolor cardstock. As you can see, all paper is going to curl up when it gets wet. That's just the nature of paper, period. Now this is the Staples cardstock, and like I said, I was really pleasantly surprised with how it handled getting inked smushed. All right, so as you can see, it's kind of curled up as well. And then we're just going to dry these papers with the heat tool. Now this one ended up with a little bit lighter wash, and some of that's just because I had less ink on my craft mat after inking the other paper. But as you can see, like it tolerated that inking, and a lot of times when you use different kind of paper with a wet medium like this, it will just kind of start breaking down almost. You can feel like a little texture to the paper that wasn't there before when it gets wet, and then even after you dry it, it stays there. Now you can see this paper does curl up a lot more than the watercolor cardstock, and that's just because it's such a thin paper. So it makes it a little bit harder to flatten out to continue working with, but it tolerates the ink smishing and the application of some light medium, so I was pretty happy about that. I don't know how it would do with like ink blending. I haven't tried that with it yet, but maybe that will be one of my next experiments, is to try some other techniques on that paper and see how it does with them. It's definitely not going to replace the distressed watercolor cardstock for me. This is just always going to be my favorite because I just prefer the way it handles, and I know it can handle everything. So as you can see, here's our two backgrounds, and they're pretty similar. I mean, the color is slightly different from one to the other, but again, that may just be because there was a little more ink on the mat with the watercolor cardstock, and then a little bit less ink when I put this paper into it. But as you can see, like, this paper is definitely a lot more warped, so I'm just gonna have to take a little time and kind of curl it back the opposite way, and you can just kind of use your fingers to kind of help roll it back and kind of flatten it out a little bit more. All right, so now we're going to do some more stamping, and this time we're going to be using that Music Notes stamp set, and I'm going to be using that Gathered Twigs again, and I'm just going to be using kind of a loosey-goosey stamping here. I'm just going to put a little ink onto my stamp and use my fingers and then kind of just position this here and just stamp a little bit onto my paper. So I'm not looking for like a full coverage design or anything like that. I'm really kind of just going for more of a mixed media feel here. And get, like, I want to put a little bit of some ink here. There we go. Do the same thing here. And then get a little bit onto the bottom down there. There we go. So here's a look at the stamping between the two of them, this distressed watercolor cardstock and then the Staples paper. And again, they're both about the same. The only big difference I notice is that the ink from the stamping is still wet on this watercolor cardstock, and it is already dry on this one. So this is just a little slower drying on this paper. The next thing I'm going to do for these backgrounds is I'm going to take that Peace on Earth die, and I'm going to use some mint tape and kind of center this die on the lower portion of the paper. And you just want to make sure that you have enough room for the embellishment that we're going to be doing. So I'm going to be using that World Globe die, and so this is the circle die that comes with it. So I can kind of position those and kind of figure out about where I'd want that to be, just so I can kind of get the design centered there. And then once you get it in position, you can just use the mint tape to hold that die in place and then run that through your die cutting machine. All right, so I have the die cutting done, and some of these letters have like a little inside piece, and if you want to keep that and kind of glue that back in, you can. Here I'm just using some mint tape to kind of keep those pieces together so I don't lose them. And then the last thing to do for these backgrounds is just to ink the edges with a little bit of ground espresso distress ink. And this is kind of where that paper warping can be a little bit of a challenge with the inking, so you just kind of have to maybe use your fingers to kind of help hold it down. And once you get it, all the layers glued together, it's gonna be just fine, but it'll be a little tricky for this part. So I'm going to work with the die cuts, and then off camera I die cut the globe and the layer pieces from some distressed watercolor cardstock. And I just prefer the watercolor cardstock for this die cutting because kind of a delicate die shape, but you could certainly do this with that Staples paper as well if you'd like. Just remember though, it's going to curl up and get very warpy, so it can be might be a little bit challenging to manage, but you could use it. And then I'm going to do some of that ink smishing again here. And on this, you could certainly just ink blend the paper instead of doing the ink smishing. You could also do spray inks if you wanted. It's really kind of up to you. And then I'm just going to give that a dry. I'll give you a little more ink on here. I'm just going to repeat that process just to kind of build up the color a little bit darker. And if you get a spot where you're not getting ink and you want some, you can always just take your finger and just kind of paint it on there. But as I was mentioning earlier, you could cut this from colored cardstock. You could ink blend the ink onto the cardstock. You could ink, do the spray stains, or oxide sprays, oxide inks, any of that you could, so you could like just color cardstock, like color a piece of cardstock and then do the die cutting from it. So just some options there on ways to do this step. I'm just gonna do a little more finger painting here to get that ink, because I'm really trying to just get it on the line portion of the globe shape, because this other pieces here are going to cover up like the land areas. And then now for these, I'm going to do a little ink smishing with the forest moss. And then give these a dry. And then now I'm just going to ink smish those into just a little bit of this gathered twigs here. I don't want a ton, so I'm just going to kind of dab that back just a teeny bit. I think I might use my finger here to get a little bit onto this one here. There we are. Give that a dry. And if you don't want your fingers all inky and stained, you could wear gloves during this part if you decide you want to do the ink smishing and coloring of the die cuts like this. And then to finish these off, I'm just going to ink the edges with a little bit of some ground espresso distress ink and just using this little tiny blending tool. And then from there, it's just a matter of using some adhesive to adhere these pieces to the die cut, and then that is ready to go for our card. The other die cut is the little Santa's sleigh, and as I mentioned earlier about using the Kraft core paper or some sort of, or even a white core paper is always one of my favorite techniques, and that's taking a little sandpaper and just kind of sanding away some of that color to reveal the core. And that's why I like this paper, is because it has the brown core to it, which I just love that kind of a just quick and easy distress effect that you achieve with this. Now, if you don't have this paper, but you do have like a black cardstock that has a white core, you could do the sanding and then take a little bit of the ground espresso ink or even the gathered twigs and just ink over those white areas to give you that brown distressed effect. And then you notice that I was doing this inside the paper that I cut this from, and the reason being is that just kind of helps hold it in place so it's less likely to rip or tear when you're doing the sanding. And then while we've got the sandpaper out, I've got another piece of the black Kraft stock, and I've cut this down to 4 by 5¼ inches. And that's going to layer on top of the background paper that we created to create a little border. And then it's also going to be behind our other background paper that we created to let the sentiment piece peek through. So it just gives you a nice bit of contrast with that black and the pumice stone colored paper. And just to make that a little bit distressed, I'm gonna sand the edges of that as well. Again, all the sanding that I'm doing here, if this is not your style or you wanna save time, this is a step you could easily skip. Here's a look at the finished cards. As you can see, there's really not a lot of difference in the background that was created using the distressed watercolor cardstock versus the Staples inkjet and laser printer paper. That said, there wasn't a ton of mediums used to create the background, but I was still pleasantly surprised at how well the Staples paper held up to the inks machine. I also wanted to share some options with this card. On this one, I used the distressed watercolor cardstock and colored the die cuts using the inks machine technique. I also added some machine stitching around the outer edge on the background paper for some additional interest. This card is exactly the same, I just skipped the stitching. And on this one, I die cut the shapes from solid colored Kraft core cardstock that I sanded just like I did on the Santa and reindeer die cut. And to save more time, I skipped the stamping on the base layer and used a piece of plain Kraft stock. I hope you enjoyed this third video in my Compartmental Christmas card making series. If you've missed the previous 2 videos, make sure and check them out using the link in the description box below. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.